certified letter arrived on a Tuesday, which I remember because I burned my toast that morning and was running late to my shift at the dental office where I'd worked for 11 years. The return address said Hargrove and Associates Estate Law, and I almost threw it in a stack of things to deal with later. Bills, insurance forms, the HOA notice about my dying rose bush. Instead, something made me tear it open right there in my driveway, still holding my keys. My uncle Walt had died 6 weeks earlier. My mother's younger brother, the one nobody talked about at Christmas, the one who'd built a medical device company in his 30s, and then more or less disappeared from the family's orbit. I had met him 4 times in my life. The last time was at my grandmother's funeral 12 years ago. And all I remembered was that he smelled like cedar and asked me, out of nowhere, what I thought about compound interest. The letter said he'd left me $9.4 million. I sat down on my front steps in my scrubs and read it 3 times. Then I called the number on the letterhead, and a paralegal named Evelyn confirmed everything in the patient tone of someone who delivered this kind of news before. The estate included liquid assets, 2 investment portfolios, and a commercial property in Portland. There were no other beneficiaries, no conditions, just my name and a number that didn't fit inside anything I understood about my own life. I called in late to work and sat in my car for 40 minutes. My husband, Ted, was at his construction management job across town. We'd been married 9 years, together for 12. He was the kind of man who planned everything: vacations, booked 8 months out, retirement spreadsheets color-coded by year, grocery lists organized by aisle. When we were broke in our mid-20s, saving up for a down payment on a house that kept getting further away, he'd been steady. When I lost a pregnancy at 14 weeks, 4 years into our marriage, and we didn't talk about it right for almost a year, he'd been steady. I believed in his steadiness, the way you believe in load-bearing walls. You don't think about them. You just trust the house won't fall. I called him from the parking lot of a Walgreens because I couldn't bring myself to just go home. "Ted," I said when he picked up, "something happened. Can you come home early?" He sighed, that particular exhale that meant he was in the middle of something. "Is it urgent? I have a site walk at 3. Yeah, it's urgent. But good. I think it's good. I think it's good." A pause. "Is everyone okay?" "Yes, everyone's fine. I just need to tell you in person." He came home at noon. I'd made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the letter in front of me like it was evidence of something. When he read it, his face went very still. Not the stillness of shock, I thought later, but the stillness of someone doing math. 9.4, he said, before taxes. Evelyn said after the estate settles, probably closer to 7 depending on. This is real. I called the firm. It's real. He set the letter down and looked at me in a way that felt slightly unfamiliar, like I'd rearranged the furniture in a room he thought he knew. Then he smiled. The wide, warm smile I'd loved since I was 23. He came around the table and hugged me hard, and I'd pressed my face into his shoulder and thought, this is the beginning of something good. That was March. By June, I'd started noticing things that didn't fit. Nothing dramatic, nothing I could point to directly. Ted started coming home later. He bought a jacket I didn't recognize and hung it in the back of the closet. He began taking calls in the garage. When I asked who he was talking to, he said work. When I said the project was supposed to be wrapping up, he said there were complications. I told myself I was catastrophizing. 9 years of marriage, 12 years of knowing him, people weren't allowed to just become different people. Then in early July, I hit a patch of black ice on the road. It was an unusually cold morning, the kind that catches you off guard in summer, and my car skidded off Route 9 into a drainage ditch. The airbag broke my wrist and cracked 2 ribs. A passing nurse called 911. I was conscious the whole time, which sounds like good luck, but mostly meant I had 20 minutes to lie at an angle in my crumpled car, thinking about how much everything hurt and how badly I wanted to hear Ted's voice. He didn't answer my first call. Or the second. The paramedic let me use the ambulance phone, and I called his cell and the office line and his personal cell, and none of them picked up. He showed up at the ER 4 hours later, while I was being moved to a room upstairs. I was so relieved to see him that I started crying, which hurt my ribs, which made me cry harder. He stood in the doorway in his work clothes and looked at me in the hospital bed and said, "God, Elaine, you scared me." He stayed 2 hours, said he had an early meeting, kissed my forehead and left. My best friend Dottie had been there since hour 2. She's a middle school art teacher with the energy of a golden retriever and a face that shows everything she's feeling. Always. She waited until Ted's footsteps faded down the hall before she sat on the edge of my bed and said, very carefully, "Is everything okay with you two?" "I had a car accident," I said. "I know. That's not what I asked." I didn't answer her. Partly because of the pain medication. Mostly because I didn't want to say out loud that something had felt wrong since March, since the letter, since the number on a page rearranged something in my husband I couldn't name. I spent 4 days in the hospital. Ted visited once more for an hour on day 3 and brought flowers that were beautiful and gas station coffee that was terrible. And we talked about the insurance claim and the car and whether we should replace or repair, and I watched him be perfectly, attentively normal in a way that made my chest hurt worse than the ribs. Dottie was there every day. On the morning they discharged me, she helped me into her car and we sat in the hospital parking lot while she found a playlist I'd like for the drive, and she said without looking at me, "I need to show you something, and I don't know how." She pulled up Instagram on her phone, a profile I didn't recognize, a woman named Fallon. She looked about 30. Dark red hair, the kind that's clearly expensive, and a way of standing in photos like she was aware of the camera, but pretending not to be. 31 weeks of posts. I scrolled back to the beginning. There was Ted. Not right away. First it was just the edges of him, a hand in a restaurant photo, a shoulder in a crowd. But 3 weeks in, there was a photo of a sunset from what looked like Shelter Island. And in the background, unmistakably, the dark green jacket from the back of our closet. "How long have you known?" I said. Dottie stared straight ahead. I wanted to be sure before I said anything. "How long, Dot?" "Since April." I handed the phone back. I looked out the window at the parking structure and the gray sky behind it. My wrist was in a soft cast and my ribs were wrapped, and I was wearing a hospital bracelet that said Elaine Moreau 41, and everything I thought I knew about my life felt like it was printed on paper that someone had left in the rain. "The money?" I said. Dottie nodded slowly. When I got home, Ted wasn't there. I'd been discharged on a Thursday, he knew the time, and the house was empty. He'd left coffee in the pot for me, the small, thoughtful gesture that had always made me feel seen. And for a second, I almost called Dottie to say I was wrong, I'd misread it. There was a reasonable explanation. Then I opened his laptop. He'd logged out, but his email was still connected to my phone as a backup account, something we'd set up years ago when he went on a work trip and forgot his password. He'd never thought to remove it. I shouldn't have looked. I knew that. I looked anyway. The emails went back 7 months. Before the letter from Hargrove and Associates. Before March. Before any of it. Ted had hired someone to research Walt's estate 6 months before Walt died. I had to read that sentence 4 times, the same way I'd read the inheritance letter. A firm out of Phoenix, the kind that does discreet asset searches for divorce attorneys and insurance companies. He paid them $4,000, which explained a credit card charge I'd noticed, and he'd explained as a site survey. They'd given him a report on Walt's holdings, the portfolios, the Portland property, the liquid assets, and a probability assessment of beneficiaries. Walt had been estranged from the family for years. My father was dead. I was the only close relative who'd maintained any contact at all, even sporadic. The report said I was the most likely beneficiary. Ted had known there was a good chance I'd inherit something significant. He'd known for 6 months. And he'd done the math before I ever opened that letter on my front steps. There were emails to Fallon, too, and I read enough of them to understand the shape of things without needing every detail. She worked at the architecture firm his company had partnered with on a waterfront project. They'd met in November. He'd told her the marriage was effectively over, that we'd been unhappy for years, that he was waiting for the right time. He'd told her about the inheritance in March, 2 days after I called him home from work, and in that email, he used the word leverage. I closed the laptop and called Dottie. She was at my house in 20 minutes. She sat across from me at the kitchen table in almost the exact same spot Ted had sat in March, and she helped me make a list of what to do next. Attorney first, then financial protection, then the rest. My attorney was a woman named Celestine who'd been recommended by a colleague and who operated out of an office above a Thai restaurant downtown with the best spring rolls I'd ever had. She was 60, matter of fact, and wore reading glasses on a chain of bright orange beads. She had the energy of someone who had watched a great many people underestimate her and had made her peace with it. "Tell me everything," she said, "from the beginning. Don't editorialize." I told her about the letter, the timeline, the jacket, Dottie's Instagram discovery, the emails. She took notes without interruption. When I finished, she took off her glasses and looked at me directly. "The inheritance is protected," she said. "You haven't commingled it with joint assets, correct?" "I haven't touched it. It's still in the estate account." "Good. Keep it there until we have everything documented, in terms of the marriage." She folded her hands. "He hasn't technically done anything illegal yet. Research into an estate isn't a crime. Having an affair isn't a crime. The question is what he does next." "What do you think he'll do next?" She considered this. "In my experience, men who've invested this kind of planning tend to keep going. He's put too much into this to stop. I'd expect him to make his move toward the assets soon, now that the accident has created some disruption." She recommended we document everything and wait. I was good at waiting. I'd waited 11 years for my career to grow at the dental office. I'd waited 4 years for my marriage to feel right again after the pregnancy. Waiting was something I knew how to do. Ted came home that evening with takeout from the Vietnamese place I liked and a careful attentiveness that I now read entirely differently. He asked about my pain level, helped me with my jacket, asked if I'd spoken to the insurance company. He was kind in the specific, deliberate way of someone who needs something from you. I was kind back. I had to be. Over the next 10 days, I watched him with the helpless clarity of someone who's learned to read a language they wished they didn't know. He took his calls in the garage. He started asking casual questions about the estate timeline. "Have you talked to the attorney yet? Is there paperwork you need help with?" And I gave him careful, small answers that were technically true and told him nothing. Celestine had coached me on this. You don't need to lie. You just don't need to volunteer. It was Dottie who found the apartment. She was dropping off soup one afternoon while Ted was at work, and she showed me the listing on her phone. Furnished 2-bedroom in a building 2 miles away, signed in Ted's name, starting the 1st of July, the same month I'd had my accident. The same month he'd visited me in the hospital twice in 4 days and left both times inside of 2 hours. He'd been planning to move out. Probably with Fallon. And whatever came next, the divorce filing, the asset negotiation, whatever legal approach he'd decided on was meant to follow shortly after. He didn't know I knew. That was the thing I kept coming back to. The morning I decided to do something about it was a Saturday. Ted was out for a run. He'd taken up running in April, which in hindsight was one of the early signs. He'd never been a runner. And I sat in the kitchen with my coffee and my cast and my fractured ribs and the weight of everything I now knew. And I called Celestine. "I want to move forward," I said. "Tell me what I need." What I needed, it turned out, was one conversation. Celestine had a contact at a forensic accounting firm who'd been involved in enough contested estate cases to know exactly what kind of documentation would be needed if Ted made a move toward my inheritance. She'd already been building the file, the emails I'd forwarded, the apartment lease Dottie had found, the timeline of the asset search he'd commissioned. What we needed now was a record of his intent, in his own words, before the lawyers got involved. This part was her idea. I'd asked if it was legal. She said single-party consent, and in my state, that meant yes. I invited him to dinner. Nothing dramatic, his favorite, chicken marsala, the good wine we'd been saving for something. He came home to the table set and candles lit and seemed genuinely, unguardedly pleased. He poured the wine and sat across from me, and I watched him settle into the comfort of the situation, the relief of a husband who thinks the worst has passed. "I've been thinking about the estate," I said after we'd eaten most of dinner. He looked up. Something flickered behind his eyes, quickly managed. "Yeah?" "I've been dragging my feet on the paperwork because the whole thing still feels surreal. But Celestine says I should make some decisions soon about how to structure things." He nodded slowly. "That makes sense. You want to be smart about it. I was thinking. I paused, looked down at my wine glass. I think I'd want you involved. However we structure it. You've always been better at the financial side than me. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the warmth of someone who'd been waiting for this. I think that's the right call, he said. We're a team. This is ours, not just yours. Ours. I kept my face still. I've actually been looking into some structures, he continued. Ways to consolidate things so they're easier to manage jointly. There are some accounts that would make more sense. What accounts? Just some investment vehicles. For tax efficiency. He reached across the table for my hand. I can walk you through it. I've done a lot of research. I nodded. I let him hold my hand. I counted to 15 in my head and thought about the emails, the apartment, the Phoenix research firm, and I kept my face warm and open and I didn't say a word. Celestine had everything she needed. The divorce filing happened 3 weeks later. Ted was served at his office, which Celestine suggested for practical reasons, and which I agreed to without the satisfaction I might have expected. By then, the forensic accountant had traced the offshore transfers. Small amounts, $150 here, $200 there. Moving through an LLC he created 6 months ago, and the full picture was in a file that Celestine described as persuasive. He called me from the parking lot of his office 4 minutes after he was served. Elaine. His voice was different. The warmth was gone. Underneath it was something I didn't recognize, something harder. You need to tell me what you think you're doing. I think I'm divorcing you, I said. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of the grocery store because I'd been in the middle of buying oranges when Celestine texted me that it was done, and for some reason I'd come outside to take the call, and now I was looking at a cart full of groceries through the store window. You don't understand what you're throwing away. What I'm throwing away, I repeated. 9 years. Everything we built together. Because you found some paperwork, Ted. My voice surprised me. It was steady. I read the emails. All of them. I know about the Phoenix firm. I know about the apartment. I know about Fallon. A pause. I also know about the accounts in the LLC. Silence. That's illegal, I said, still steady. My attorney thinks there's a case for fraud. The forensic accountant agrees. Another silence, longer. When he spoke again, the hardness was still there, but something underneath it had cracked. I made mistakes, he said, but I wasn't going to. You used the word leverage in an email to your girlfriend, I said. About me. About my inheritance from my uncle. So I need you to understand that I have read every word of what you wrote, and I know exactly what you were planning. He hung up. I sat in the parking lot for another 10 minutes, then went back inside and finished shopping. The oranges were on sale. What followed was 6 months of legal negotiation that I lived through mostly by focusing on small, manageable things. The garden, the dental office, where my coworkers asked no questions and simply left good coffee on my desk on hard mornings. Dottie, who came over every Thursday for dinner and watched trash television with me until one of us fell asleep. Celestine, who called me once a week and spoke to me in the plain, calm language of someone who had helped a great many people through a great many impossible things. The inheritance was protected. In my state, assets inherited during a marriage remain separate property, provided they haven't been commingled with marital funds, and I hadn't touched mine. Ted's attorney tried several approaches and Celestine shut them down with a patience I found almost admirable. He walked away with what was legally his from the marriage, his half of the house equity, his retirement accounts, and not a dollar of Walt's money. The Portland property sold in October. I used part of the proceeds to pay off my sister's medical debt, which she'd been carrying for 3 years and hadn't told me about until I asked directly. She cried on the phone, and I told her it wasn't a big deal, and she said, of course it was a big deal, don't be ridiculous, and I said, fine, it's a big deal, and we laughed for the first time in months. I also funded a small nonprofit with Celestine's help, a legal aid organization that specifically supports women navigating asset protection in divorce cases. Not because I'd seen myself as a victim in any grand sense, but because Celestine had told me, once, that most of her clients couldn't afford her. That stuck with me. The idea that what had protected me was partly just luck, the luck of being able to pay for the right attorney, the right accountant, the right knowledge. Other people shouldn't have to rely on luck. Dottie threw a party when the divorce was finalized in December. Not a sad one. She specifically said no sad energy, and she filled her apartment with people I loved and made the kind of food that you only make when you mean it. And at some point, late in the evening, I sat on her back porch in my coat and looked up at the cold sky and felt something I hadn't expected. Relief so complete, it was almost like grief. Because here's what nobody tells you about the end of something you've believed in for a long time. Even when you're sure it had to end. Even when you can see clearly that the thing you were holding on to had already become something else, there's still a moment when you put it down and you feel the weight of the empty space where it was. I drove home that night thinking about Walt. He'd been estranged from our family for reasons I'd never fully understood. Something about a business dispute with my grandfather that went sideways and was never repaired. Walt had chosen his work over the family's version of events, and I think the family never forgave him for being right. He'd spent his life building something carefully and quietly, and had died with more money than most people could imagine, and almost nobody at his bedside. But he'd known me, in his way. He'd noticed me at my grandmother's funeral, a 29-year-old in a cheap black dress asking a stranger about compound interest without knowing why, and something in that had mattered to him. Enough that 12 years later, he'd left me everything. I'd gone back to Evelyn, the paralegal at Hargrove & Associates, after the divorce was finalized. I wanted to understand it better. She'd pulled the notes from when Walt had updated the will 2 years before he died, and she read me the comment he'd left in the file. She's the only one who ever asked me a real question. Leave it to her. That was all. That was the whole explanation. I framed it. It's in my kitchen now, above the coffee maker, where I see it every morning when I'm running late and burning my toast and trying to remember what kind of person I want to be that day. The new year came in, cold and bright. I took a week off from the dental office and drove up to see the Portland property one last time before the sale. Fully closed, a commercial space in a neighborhood full of bookstores and old buildings being slowly, carefully restored. I stood on the sidewalk in front of it and tried to imagine Walt walking the same sidewalk decades earlier, deciding this was worth something. I think he would have liked what I'm doing with his money. I think he would have called my financial decisions reasonably sound, in the grudging way of someone who doesn't give compliments easily. I think he would have been quietly pleased that I didn't give the nonprofit a sentimental name. It's called the Hargrove Fund. Because that's the letter that started everything, because the name was already there, and sometimes the truth is just that practical. On the drive back from Portland, I stopped at a rest area somewhere in the middle of nowhere and called my sister, and we talked for an hour about nothing in particular. Her kids, my rosebush, a documentary we'd both watched without telling each other. And at some point she said, "I'm glad you're okay," in the simple, certain way that only people who really mean it can say it. I told her I was, and I was. Not in the way I'd thought I'd be at this point in my life. Not the version of okay that comes with everything going according to plan, but a different kind. The kind that's been tested and held. The kind you earn by getting to the other side of something you weren't sure you could survive. The rosebush came back the following spring. I hadn't done anything special, just stopped fighting the HOA and let it do what it wanted. It came back scraggly and strange looking at first, then all at once, in a week in April, covered in small red blooms that I hadn't planted and couldn't explain. I took a picture and sent it to Dottie. She sent back 3 fire emojis and a voice memo of her screaming, which is, honestly, exactly the kind of person you want in your corner when the hard part is finally over. I used to think betrayal looks like a dramatic moment, a slammed door, a confession, something you could point to and say, "There, that's where it happened." But when I look back at everything with Ted, I see now that it was built in quiet increments, in small decisions he made when he thought no one was watching. The research firm in Phoenix, the LLC, the apartment signed 2 months before he ever mentioned anything was wrong. Betrayal, real betrayal, doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. And here's the thing about choices made in secret. They never actually stay secret. Not fully. The jacket in the back of the closet. The calls taken in the garage. The credit card charge explained a little too smoothly. People who are planning something leave traces because they're human, and humans are not as careful as they believe themselves to be when they're convinced they're the smartest person in the room. Ted believed he was the smartest person in the room for a long time. Maybe he was in certain rooms, but he made one miscalculation that undid everything. He assumed that because I'd been patient for 9 years, I was passive. He confused my steadiness with weakness. He saw someone who'd worked the same job for 11 years, who'd kept the peace in a hard marriage, who'd folded herself into the shape of what was needed. And he decided that person could be managed. What he didn't account for was that the same quality that made me easy to underestimate, the willingness to wait, to observe, to absorb, is also exactly what allowed me to document everything carefully before I made a single move. Celestine didn't save me. Dottie didn't save me. I'd been paying attention for months before either of them knew what was happening. That's not luck. That's what happens when you've spent years learning to read a room because you had to. I think about Walt sometimes, the uncle I barely knew, who left me everything because I once asked him a real question. He built his entire life on the premise that clear thinking is worth more than charm, that patience is a strategy, not a surrender. I didn't know him well enough to learn that from him directly, but somehow, when it mattered most, I acted like someone who had. The Hargrove Fund is real now, small but real. And the women who come through it. Women who are in the middle of exactly what I survived, who don't know yet that they'll get to the other side. They're not there because they're victims. They're there because the system requires knowledge and resources to navigate, and knowledge shouldn't only belong to people who can already afford it. That's not fairness, that's just compounding disadvantage. What I know, on the other side of all of it, is this. The thing that protects you is almost never dramatic. It's not a speech or a confrontation or a single brave decision. It's the accumulation of small, clear-eyed choices made over time. It's paying attention when something feels wrong even before you can name what it is. It's being willing to be uncomfortable with what you find. It's trusting yourself enough to act on it. Ted used the word leverage about me in an email to his girlfriend. He meant it as a resource, something to position and manage, but the same inheritance he was trying to maneuver around is now funding legal aid for women who can't afford to protect themselves. That's not irony. That's just what happens when someone tries to use your life as a tool, and you decide, quietly and completely, not to let them. The rosebush came back in April. I didn't do anything special. I just stopped fighting it.